If I had a dime for every just a work dinner my wife Alicia mentioned, I'd have enough to buy a new couch for every time I ended up sleeping on the old one. But this Tuesday night felt different. Maybe it was the way she spent 45 minutes picking out the perfect black dress, or how she applied her makeup with the precision of a surgeon preparing for the operation of her life. "Greg, have you seen my good earrings?" Alicia called from our bedroom, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying too hard to sound casual. I looked up from my beer, and the restaurant invoices spread across our kitchen table. Being a district manager for a chain of family restaurants wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me plenty of material for cynical observations about human nature. "Which good earrings? The ones you wore to your sister's wedding, or the ones you save for impressing people you claim not to care about impressing?" She appeared in the doorway, stunning in that black dress that hugged every curve I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago. At 35, Alicia still turned heads, and she knew it. Her auburn hair cascaded over her shoulders, and those green eyes that used to look at me with genuine affection now seemed to look through me. The diamond studs. And don't be sarcastic, Greg. It doesn't suit you. Funny, I thought sarcasm was one of my few remaining attractive qualities. I took another sip of beer, watching her rifle through her jewelry box with the intensity of someone searching for buried treasure. "So remind me again why this dinner with your boss is so important." Alicia paused, her fingers hovering over a pair of pearl earrings before settling on the diamonds. "Dominic wants to discuss the new HR initiatives for next quarter. It's a working dinner, Greg. You know, the kind of thing adults do to advance their careers." There it was, that subtle dig about my own career trajectory. As if managing 4 restaurants and dealing with staff turnover, supply chain issues, and corporate bureaucracy wasn't real work. But I'd learned to pick my battles with Alicia, especially lately. "Right, of course. And his wife Janet is joining you for this working dinner?" The pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it. 12 years of marriage had taught me to read Alicia's tells like a poker player studying an opponent's nervous tics. "Janet's visiting her sister in Phoenix this week. It's just going to be me, Dominic, and a few other department heads." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral while my gut twisted into familiar knots. Dominic Carter was 58, silver-haired, and possessed what Alicia called old-school charm. What I called it wasn't suitable for polite company. He'd been her boss for 8 months, ever since the company restructured, and she'd been promoted to senior HR coordinator. 8 months of late meetings, weekend conferences, and work dinners that seemed to multiply like rabbits in spring. "Well, have fun discussing quarterly initiatives," I said, returning my attention to the invoices. "I'll be here, living vicariously through spreadsheets and vendor complaints." Alicia moved behind my chair, her hands resting briefly on my shoulders. For a moment, I caught a whiff of her perfume. Not the usual scent she wore, but something new, something expensive. "You could try to be more supportive, you know. This promotion could really open doors for us." "I am supportive. I'm also realistic. And realistically speaking, most career-advancing conversations don't require quite this level of wardrobe consultation." She stepped away, and I could feel the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "You know what, Greg? Sometimes I think you'd be happier if I just stayed home, cooked your dinner, and asked you how your day went while you complained about corporate policy and difficult customers." "That's not fair, and you know it." "Is it? Because lately, every time I mention work, you get this look on your face like you're sucking on a lemon. God forbid I should have ambitions beyond this house and this neighborhood." I turned in my chair to face her fully. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, looking like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a closing argument. Beautiful, successful, and increasingly distant. That was my wife, in a nutshell. "Alicia, I don't have a problem with your ambitions. I have a problem with the fact that these ambitions seem to require an awful lot of after-hours FaceTime with your married boss. Her eyes flashed. Dominic has been nothing but professional with me. He's been married to Janet for 23 years, Greg. 23 years. He's not some predatory executive looking to chase after his subordinates. Right. Because married men never stray, especially not successful, powerful married men with young, attractive employees. Young? I'm 35, not 22. And if you can't trust me to handle myself in a professional setting, then we have bigger problems than you think. The conversation was heading toward territory we'd mapped extensively over the past few months. I could see the familiar landmarks, my jealousy, her indignation, my sarcasm, her accusations of insecurity. It was a well-worn path that led nowhere productive. You're right, I said, raising my hands in surrender. I'm being paranoid. Go have your dinner, discuss your initiatives, and I'll be here when you get home. She studied my face, looking for traces of sarcasm or hidden resentment. Finding none, or at least none she could definitively identify, she nodded curtly. Thank you. I should be home by 10:30 at the latest. After she left, trailing expensive perfume and the click of heels I didn't recognize, I sat in our kitchen nursing my beer and staring at invoices that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the attention I was paying them. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard, my assistant manager, and the closest thing I had to a best friend in this town. Want to grab a beer? Susan's at book club and I'm staring at a frozen dinner that looks like it died of natural causes. I texted back, come over, bring more beer. Alicia's at another work dinner. Another one? Damn, her company sure likes to eat. Tell me about it. Richard arrived 20 minutes later with a 12-pack of craft beer and the kind of knowing expression that suggested he'd connected dots I was still pretending not to see. So, he said, settling into the chair Alicia had vacated. Work dinner number what this month? I've stopped counting. Apparently, the modern corporate world requires more after-hours dining than a food critics convention. Richard opened a beer and studied me with the directness that made him good at his job and occasionally uncomfortable as a friend. He was 42, divorced, and possessed a cynicism that made my own seem optimistic by comparison. Greg, I'm going to say something, and you're going to want to punch me, but I'm going to say it anyway because that's what friends do. This should be good. Janet Carter shops at the same grocery store as Susan. They've talked a few times in the produce section. You know, typical suburban wife small talk. Last week, Janet mentioned that Dominic's been working late a lot lately, coming home after 10 most nights. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. And she seemed surprised when Susan mentioned that you'd been complaining about Alicia's work dinners. Janet said Dominic usually just grabs something from the vending machine when he works late. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between us like smoke from a fire neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Maybe he's been grabbing dinner out before coming home, I said finally. Maybe. Maybe Janet doesn't know about all of his work obligations. Maybe. Maybe I'm being a paranoid husband who watches too many movies where the cheating spouse always claims it's just work. Richard took a long pull from his beer. Maybe. Or maybe your gut is trying to tell you something your brain doesn't want to hear. My phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Not Alicia. She'd texted at 10:15 to say the dinner was running late and she'd be home soon. The caller ID showed Janet Carter. Greg? I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm worried sick. Dominic said he was working late tonight, but I drove by his office and his car isn't there. I've been calling him for 2 hours and it goes straight to voicemail. My mouth went dry. Janet, Alicia mentioned the work dinner to you, didn't she? Where did they go? I need to find him. His blood pressure medication is at home and he's supposed to take it by 11. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. I don't know where they went. Alicia just said it was a work dinner with department heads. Department heads? Greg, there's only one other department head, and she's been in Seattle all week at a conference. I checked. The cold thing in my stomach spread outward, numbing my fingers and making it hard to breathe properly. Janet, maybe we should... I'm driving around looking for them. If you hear from Alicia, please call me. I'm scared something's happened. After she hung up, I sat staring at my phone while Richard watched me, with the expression of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Well, I said finally, I think we just found out where those work dinners have been leading. Janet called back at 12:23 a.m., her voice tight with controlled fury. I found them. 2 words that managed to contain an entire world of betrayal, humiliation, and the particular kind of rage that comes from having your suspicions confirmed in the worst possible way. Where? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. The Marriott downtown. Dominic's car is in the parking garage. Level 3, space 47. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to go up to the room or call his mother and tell her what her precious boy is doing. I was already reaching for my keys. Janet, don't do anything yet. I'm coming down there. You don't have to. Yes, I do. The drive downtown took 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours. Richard had offered to come along, but this was something I needed to face alone. Well, not entirely alone. Janet's Honda was parked 3 spaces away from Dominic's silver BMW, and she was sitting behind the wheel like a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. I knocked on her passenger window. She unlocked the door, and I slid into the seat beside her. Janet Carter was 56, with graying blonde hair and the kind of understated elegance that came from 23 years of being married to a successful man. Tonight, she looked like someone who'd been hit by a truck carrying a full load of bitter reality. Room 412, she said without preamble. I called the front desk and said I was surprising my husband for our anniversary. The desk clerk was very helpful. Janet, maybe we should think about this. Think about what? Think about how my husband of 23 years is upstairs screwing your wife? Think about how I spent the evening calling hospitals because I was worried he'd had a heart attack? Think about how I defended him last month when my sister said she saw him having lunch with a younger woman. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. I reached over and gently took the car keys from her fingers. We're going to go up there, I said. We're going to knock on the door, and we're going to handle this like adults, even if they haven't been acting like adults. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was silent, except for the mechanical whir of cables and pulleys. Janet stared at the floor numbers as they climbed, her face set in an expression of grim determination. I tried to think of something to say, some words of comfort or wisdom, but what do you tell someone whose marriage is about to explode in a hotel hallway? Room 412 was at the end of the corridor, tucked away in the kind of location that suggested either romance or secrecy. Given the circumstances, I was betting on the latter. I knocked. Not the aggressive pounding of an enraged husband, but the firm, steady knock of someone who had every right to be there. Dominic, Janet called out. I know you're in there. Silence. Then the sound of urgent whispering, followed by footsteps. The door opened 6 inches, held by the security chain. Dominic's face appeared in the gap, his silver hair disheveled, wearing a hotel bathrobe that had clearly been put on in a hurry. Janet, what are you doing here? I could ask you the same question, but I think I already know the answer. Dominic's eyes shifted to me, and I saw the moment he realized this wasn't going to be a private conversation between husband and wife. Greg, this isn't what it looks like. Really? Because it looks like you're in a hotel room with my wife, while yours has been driving around town worried sick about your blood pressure medication. The chain rattled as Dominic fumbled with it. The door opened fully, revealing him in that bathrobe and Alicia behind him, wrapped in a hotel towel, her carefully applied makeup smeared and her hair looking like she'd been through a windstorm. Greg, I can explain, Alicia started, but Janet cut her off. 23 years, Janet said, her voice carrying down the hallway with perfect clarity. 23 years, and this is what I get. a hotel room, and a woman young enough to be your daughter. She's not young enough to be my daughter, Dominic protested, as if that was the important detail to clarify. Oh, forgive me. She's only 15 years younger than your wife. That makes it so much better. Other doors were opening along the hallway. This was turning into exactly the kind of public spectacle that would be talked about in certain circles for months to come. Part of me felt embarrassed by the scene we were creating. A larger part of me was glad that their betrayal was being witnessed. Can we please take this inside? Alicia asked, clutching the towel tighter around herself. Inside? I laughed, and the sound came out harsher than I'd intended. You mean inside the hotel room you've been using to fuck your boss? Sure, let's all crowd in there and discuss this like civilized people. Greg, don't what? Don't be upset. Don't make a scene. Don't act like a husband who just found his wife in a hotel room with another man. Dominic stepped forward, trying to assert some kind of authority. Now look here, Greg. I understand you're upset, but there's no need for this kind of language. I stared at him for a moment, this silver-haired man in his hotel bathrobe, trying to lecture me about appropriate behavior while standing next to my half-naked wife. You're right, Dominic. There's no need for language. There's a need for honesty. So let me be honest. You're a pathetic middle-aged cliché who couldn't keep his dick in his pants. And my wife is apparently the kind of woman who thinks screwing her boss is a career advancement strategy. That's enough, Alicia snapped. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about work dinners that aren't work dinners. I'm talking about new perfume and new earrings and the way you've been looking at me like I'm some kind of obstacle to your happiness. Janet had been standing quietly during this exchange, but now she stepped forward, her purse clutched in both hands like a weapon. Dominic, I want you to come home. Now. We're going to discuss this properly, and then you're going to decide whether you want to be married to me or whether you want to be a divorced man having a midlife crisis in hotel rooms. Janet, it's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You made a choice. Now you get to live with the consequences. She turned to Alicia, and her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than shouting. And you, dear, you get to explain to your husband why you threw away 12 years of marriage for a man who's going to drop you the moment this becomes inconvenient for him. With that, Janet turned and walked back toward the elevators, her heels clicking on the hallway carpet with military precision. Dominic looked between Alicia and the retreating figure of his wife, clearly calculating which crisis required more immediate attention. I have to go, he said to Alicia. We'll talk tomorrow. Dominic, wait. But he was already hurrying after Janet, the hotel bathrobe flapping around his legs like the wings of some ridiculous bird. I was left standing in the hallway with my wife, who was still wrapped in a hotel towel, surrounded by curious faces peering out from behind partially open doors. Greg, please, let me explain. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the woman I'd built a life with. This was someone who could lie to my face about work dinners while planning hotel room encounters with her boss. Explain what, Alicia? Explain how this is somehow my fault? Explain how you ended up naked in a hotel room by accident? Explain how I'm supposed to pretend this never happened? It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. And you know what the worst part is? I suspected. For months, I suspected. And you made me feel like I was crazy. Like I was some paranoid, jealous husband who couldn't handle his wife's success. I turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back at her one more time. Get dressed, Alicia. Go home. And tomorrow, we'll figure out what happens next. The elevator doors closed on the image of my wife standing alone in a hotel hallway, wrapped in a towel, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. But I felt no satisfaction in her humiliation, no sense of victory or vindication. I just felt empty. The next morning arrived with the subtle cruelty of a hangover. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. Alicia had come home sometime after 2 a.m. I'd heard her car in the driveway, her key in the lock, her footsteps on the stairs, but I'd pretended to be asleep, and she hadn't tried to wake me. Now she sat across from me at our kitchen table, fully dressed for work, as if nothing had happened, as if the previous night had been some kind of shared nightmare we'd both agreed to forget. "We need to talk," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "I'm listening." She looked up at me, and I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed despite the careful application of concealer, and there was a fragility to her that I hadn't seen since her father died 3 years ago. "What happened last night? It's not what you think." I took a sip of my coffee and waited. After 12 years of marriage, I'd learned that sometimes the best response to an obvious lie is silence. Dominic and I have been working closely together on the restructuring project. You know that. And yes, we've developed a friendship. But last night was the first time anything physical happened between us. The first time you had sex with him, or the first time anything physical happened? The distinction seemed to catch her off guard. The first time anything happened. "Greg, I swear to you, we never—" "So, all those work dinners were actually work dinners?" "Yes. And the new perfume, the new clothes, the way you've been distant and distracted for months, that's all just coincidence?" She set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "You're twisting everything. Yes, I bought new perfume. Yes, I've been working longer hours, but that doesn't mean I've been having an affair." I stared at her across the table, this woman I'd loved for 12 years, and marveled at her ability to reshape reality to fit her narrative. It was almost impressive in its audacity. "Alicia, I found you in a hotel room with your boss. You were wearing a towel. He was wearing a bathrobe. What exactly am I supposed to think happened? That you were reviewing quarterly reports in your underwear?" Her face flushed. "We had dinner. We talked about work, about the future of the department. We had some wine. Things got complicated." "Complicated?" "Yes, complicated. I'm not proud of what happened, but it wasn't some calculated affair. It was a mistake, a moment of poor judgment." I nodded slowly, as if I were actually considering this explanation. "So if I called the hotel and asked how many times room 412 has been reserved under Dominic's name in the past 3 months, what do you think they'd tell me?" The question hung between us like smoke from a fire. Alicia's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, defiance, and finally something that might have been resignation. "It doesn't matter what they'd tell you. What matters is what I'm telling you now." "Which is what, exactly?" "That I made a mistake, that I'm sorry, that I want to work on our marriage." I stood up from the table, suddenly needing to move, to do something with the restless energy that was building inside me like steam in a pressure cooker. "You want to work on our marriage? After you fucked your boss in a hotel room, you want to work on our marriage?" "Don't say it like that." "How should I say it? How should I describe what happened last night?" She stood up too, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You could try being understanding. You could try recognizing that marriages go through difficult periods and that people make mistakes." "Understanding?" I laughed, and the sound was bitter even to my own ears. "You want me to be understanding about your adultery?" "It wasn't adultery. It was one night. One mistake. One night that I know about." The accusation hit its mark. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed, in the way her eyes darted away from mine before snapping back with defiant anger. "You know what, Greg? Maybe this is exactly what our marriage needed. Maybe it needed something to shake us out of the rut we've been in for the past 2 years." "What rut?" "The rut where we barely talk to each other except about bills and schedules. The rut where we have sex twice a month like it's some kind of marital obligation. The rut where you come home from work and complain about corporate policy while I pretend to be interested." Her words hit like physical blows, each one finding its target with surgical precision. Because there was truth in what she was saying, Enough truth to make me question everything I thought I knew about our relationship. So, this is my fault. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying we both let our marriage drift into something neither of us wanted. And your solution was to start fucking your boss. My solution was to find someone who made me feel alive again. Someone who listened to me, who was interested in what I had to say, who made me feel like I was more than just a wife going through the motions. The honesty was brutal and unexpected. For a moment, I saw past the lies and justifications to something that might have been the truth, or at least her version of it. And now? Now I want to try to find that feeling with you again, if you're willing to try. I looked at her standing there in our kitchen, beautiful and desperate and asking for something I wasn't sure I could give. Forgiveness, maybe, or the ability to pretend that trust could be rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. I need time to think. How much time? I don't know. More than one conversation over coffee. She nodded, and for the first time since I'd found her in that hotel room, she looked like the woman I'd married, vulnerable, hopeful, and heartbreakingly human. I'll be at work. Call me if you want to talk. After she left, I sat in our kitchen surrounded by the detritus of 12 years of shared life, coffee cups with matching chips, a refrigerator covered with photos from happier times, a calendar marking anniversaries and birthdays that suddenly felt like relics from someone else's marriage. My phone rang. Richard. How are you holding up? I've been better. How did you know? Janet Carter called Susan this morning. Apparently the whole thing is already making the rounds. Small town, big gossip. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. Of course it was. In a town this size, a scene like last night's hotel confrontation was like throwing a stone into a still pond. The ripples would spread outward until everyone had heard some version of the story. What are people saying? The usual bullshit. Half of them are calling Alicia a homewrecker, the other half are saying you must have driven her to it. You know how it goes. I did know how it went. In small towns, everyone was an expert on everyone else's marriage, and every crisis became public entertainment. Richard, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Shoot. Did you know? Before last night, did you suspect something was going on? There was a pause, long enough to confirm what I already knew. I had suspicions. Nothing concrete, just little things. The way she talked about Dominic, the way she dressed for work lately, and Susan mentioned seeing them together at lunch a few times. Why didn't you say anything? What was I supposed to say? Hey, Greg, I think your wife might be cheating on you based on absolutely no evidence. You would have told me I was crazy, and you would have been right to. He was right, of course. I would have defended Alicia, would have accused him of stirring up trouble, would have done exactly what husbands always do when confronted with uncomfortable truths about their marriages. So what now? Richard asked. Now I figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. And Alicia? I looked around our kitchen, at the life we'd built together, at the evidence of 12 years of shared dreams and compromises and small daily kindnesses. I don't know yet. But I know one thing. I'm done being the understanding husband who pretends everything is fine when it's not. That afternoon, I drove to Dominic's office building. Not to confront him. I'd had enough confrontation for one 24-hour period. I just wanted to see him, to observe him in his natural habitat, to try to understand what my wife had found so irresistible about this silver-haired man in expensive suits. The building was one of those generic corporate structures that housed insurance companies, law firms, and consulting businesses, the kind of place where people in suits made important decisions that affected other people's lives. Dominic's BMW was in the parking lot, parked in a handicapped space despite the obvious absence of any handicap placard. I sat in my car and watched the building's entrance, feeling like a private investigator in a bad movie. After about 20 minutes, Dominic emerged, walking quickly toward his car with the purposeful stride of a man trying to project confidence he didn't feel. He looked older in the daylight, more ordinary. The silver hair that had seemed distinguished in the hotel hallway now looked like an obvious attempt to hide advancing age. His expensive suit couldn't quite disguise a slight paunch around his middle, and there was something in his posture that suggested a man carrying a heavy burden. As he reached his car, he looked around the parking lot with the paranoid awareness of someone who expected to be watched. Our eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, we stared at each other like gunslingers in an old western. Then he got in his BMW and drove away, leaving me sitting alone in a parking lot, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do next. The neighborhood barbecue was Janet's idea, though she presented it to me as if it had been a spontaneous inspiration rather than a carefully calculated act of social warfare. "I'm having a little get-together this Saturday," she said when she called Thursday evening. "Just neighbors, a few friends. I thought it might be nice for people to see that life goes on, you know?" I knew exactly what she meant. In the 3 days since the hotel incident, both our marriages had become the primary source of entertainment for our social circle. People were choosing sides, spreading rumors, and generally treating our personal crisis like their favorite soap opera. "Janet, I'm not sure I'm ready for a social gathering." "That's exactly why you need to come. If you hide in your house, people will assume you're ashamed or defeated." "Are you ashamed, Greg?" "No." "Are you defeated?" I thought about that for a moment. Was I defeated? Humiliated, certainly. Angry, absolutely. But defeated? That suggested giving up, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. "No, I'm not defeated." "Then you'll come. And Greg? Bring something to share, something that shows you're doing just fine." Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed designed to mock human misery. Clear skies, gentle breeze, temperatures in the mid-70s. I spent the morning preparing my contribution to Janet's barbecue, a large pot of my grandmother's chili, the recipe that had won 3 county fair competitions and countless compliments at neighborhood gatherings. As I carried the pot across the street to Janet's backyard, I could see that she'd invited more people than she'd suggested. Cars lined both sides of the street, and the sound of conversation and laughter drifted over her fence like smoke from the grill. "Greg?" Janet appeared at my elbow as soon as I entered the backyard, taking the chili pot from my hands with the efficiency of an experienced hostess. "I'm so glad you came. Everyone's been asking about you." I'll bet they have, I thought. But I smiled and nodded and tried to project the image of a man who was handling his personal crisis with dignity and grace. The backyard was full of familiar faces, neighbors, co-workers, friends from our social circle who were now navigating the awkward territory of a group dynamic disrupted by scandal. Conversations paused as I moved through the crowd, resuming in slightly lower tones after I passed. "Greg, how are you holding up?" This from Susan, Richard's wife, who had the kind of concerned expression that suggested she'd been designated as the official information gatherer. "I'm doing fine, Susan. Thanks for asking. If you need anything, someone to talk to, help with meals, whatever, you just let me know." I thanked her and moved on, accepting condolences and expressions of support that felt like the social equivalent of a funeral receiving line. Everyone was very kind, very understanding, and very obviously curious about details I had no intention of sharing. I was talking to Mike Henderson about his new landscaping project when I saw them arrive. Alicia and Dominic walking through Janet's back gate together like a couple arriving at a dinner party. The conversation around me faltered and died as people noticed what I was seeing. Alicia looked beautiful, as always. She was wearing a sundress I'd bought her for her birthday 2 years ago, and her hair was pulled back in the casual style she knew I loved. Dominic was beside her, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, looking like a man who'd decided that the best defense was a good offense. Janet appeared beside me, her voice low and urgent. "I didn't invite them." I know. Do you want me to ask them to leave? I watched my wife scan the crowd until her eyes found mine. There was something defiant in her expression, something that suggested she'd come here to make a statement rather than to enjoy a neighborhood barbecue. No, I said. Let them stay. What followed was perhaps the most uncomfortable social gathering in the history of suburban entertaining. Conversations became stilted and artificial as people tried to navigate the presence of all the principals in what was rapidly becoming the neighborhood's most talked-about scandal. Alicia and Dominic positioned themselves near the drinks table, accepting beverages and making small talk with the kind of determined normalcy that fooled no one. I stayed on the opposite side of the yard, surrounded by a protective circle of friends and neighbors who seemed to have appointed themselves as my unofficial support group. This is awkward as hell, Richard muttered, appearing at my elbow with 2 beers. It's about to get more awkward. What do you mean? I nodded toward the back gate, where Janet's husband was making his entrance. Dominic saw him at the same time I did, and I watched the color drain from his face as he realized he was about to face his wife and his mistress in the same social setting. Janet moved through the crowd with the purposeful stride of a woman on a mission. She walked directly to where Dominic and Alicia were standing, smiled pleasantly, and said in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet backyard, "Dominic, darling, I wasn't expecting to see you here, especially not with your little friend." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking 3 houses away. "Janet," Dominic started, but she cut him off with a gesture. "Oh, don't mind me. I'm just here to enjoy the party. In fact, I have a little announcement to make." She turned to face the crowd, her smile bright and terrible. "For those of you who haven't heard, my husband has decided to explore new opportunities in his personal life. I wanted you all to know that I'll be exploring some new opportunities of my own. Specifically, I'll be exploring how much of his assets I can claim in our divorce settlement." The crowd stirred uneasily. This was more drama than most suburban barbecues could handle. "Janet, please," Dominic said, his voice strained. "This isn't the place, isn't it? You seem to think public displays were appropriate when you were parading around town with Greg's wife. I'm just following your lead." Alicia stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Mrs. Carter, I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Janet laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, my dear, I'm not upset. I'm liberated. For the first time in 23 years, I don't have to pretend I don't know about my husband's wandering eye. I don't have to make excuses for his late nights or his mysterious phone calls or his sudden interest in working dinners." She turned back to Dominic, and her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the yard. "You want to play house with a younger woman? Go right ahead. But you'll do it without my money, without my house, and without my respectability to hide behind." The crowd was riveted. This was better than anything they could have seen on television, and it was happening right here in their own neighborhood. I found myself moving forward, drawn by some instinct I didn't fully understand. Maybe it was the desire to support Janet in her moment of public vindication. Maybe it was the need to finally confront the situation that had been destroying my life for months. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said, my voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "I actually feel sorry for you, Dominic." He turned to face me, his expression wary. "Greg, I don't think this is the time." "No, I think this is exactly the time. See, I've been thinking about this whole situation, trying to understand how a man throws away a 23-year marriage for a few months of hotel room encounters, and I think I've figured it out." I looked around the crowd, at all these people who'd been whispering about my marriage, speculating about my failures as a husband, wondering how I'd driven my wife into another man's arms. "You didn't want Alicia," I continued. "You wanted the idea of Alicia. You wanted to feel young again, powerful again, desirable again. You wanted to prove that you could still attract a younger woman even if it meant destroying 2 marriages in the process. Dominic's face was flushed now, his composure cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Then explain it to me. Explain how a man who's been married for over 2 decades suddenly decides that his wife isn't enough anymore. Explain how that same man convinces himself that seducing a subordinate is somehow romantic rather than pathetic. Greg, stop, Alicia said, stepping between us. This isn't helping anyone. I looked at my wife, standing there in the dress I'd bought her, defending the man she'd chosen over our marriage, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of cold clarity. You're right, I said. This isn't helping anyone. But you know what? I'm done trying to help. I'm done trying to understand. I'm done pretending that what you did was some kind of mistake that we can work through with counseling and good intentions. I turned to address the crowd, these neighbors and friends who'd been watching our marriage collapse like spectators at a demolition. For those of you keeping score at home, here's what happened. My wife decided that 12 years of marriage wasn't as important as a few months of excitement with her boss. Her boss decided that 23 years of marriage was a small price to pay for feeling young again. And now they're both here, at a neighborhood barbecue, acting like their choices don't have consequences. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of someone's cell phone buzzing and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. But here's the thing about consequences, I continued, and my voice stayed calm because calm was the only weapon in a crowd like this. They don't care whether you're ready for them or not. They don't care whether you think your actions were justified. They just show up and make themselves at home. The backyard was bright with late afternoon sun, the kind of sun that makes everything look almost too cheerful, as if the world was mocking you with good weather. Smoke drifted from the grill in slow, sweet ribbons, carrying the smell of charred meat and onion and something sugary in the marinade. Paper plates sat stacked on a folding table. Plastic cups clinked with ice. People laughed too loudly and tried to pretend they weren't listening, but every laugh had an edge now, because no one could pretend they hadn't heard what I said. I walked over to where Dominic was standing, close enough that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead, despite the pleasant temperature. He held a beer he hadn't sipped in 5 minutes, his fingers too tight around the bottle. His posture was still trying to project confidence, but confidence is a performance, and performances crumble when the audience stops applauding. He'd expected me to yell. He'd expected me to make a scene that made him look like the reasonable one. He'd expected anger he could dismiss. He hadn't expected a voice that sounded like a verdict. You want to know what your consequences look like? I asked, and the words fell into the air without drama. Your wife is going to take half of everything you own. Your reputation in this town is shot. Your colleagues are going to look at you and see a middle-aged cliché who couldn't keep his personal life from destroying his professional credibility. Dominic's jaw flexed. His eyes flicked past me, scanning the faces nearby, looking for rescue in the form of someone stepping in to tell me I was being harsh. Nobody moved. A few people stared at their cups. Someone coughed. Someone's phone buzzed and was quickly silenced. I saw a man I recognized from Dominic's office. He'd once introduced him as a good guy to know, watching with a look that was half disgust, half relief that he wasn't the one being called out. Dominic tried to speak, but all that came out was air. He licked his lips as if he could taste the truth now, bitter and unavoidable. This is, he started. Predictable. I finished for him. That's what it is. Then I turned to Alicia, my wife of 12 years, the woman I'd loved and trusted and built a life with. She stood near the patio, hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to hold herself together by force. Her eyes were wet, but her chin was lifted, and there was something in her expression that I recognized with a sick clarity. She wanted sympathy without accountability. She wanted me to stop so she could cry and be comforted, not so she could admit what she'd chosen. "And you?" I said, and my voice changed slightly, not softer, just more precise. "You get to be known as the woman who threw away her marriage for a man who's going to drop you the moment the divorce gets expensive. You get to start over at 35, looking for a new job because everyone at your current workplace knows exactly why your boss's marriage fell apart." Alicia flinched as if the words were physical. Her lips parted, and for a second she looked like she might deny it, might claim I was exaggerating, might try to spin herself back into victimhood. But she didn't, because she knew I wasn't wrong. She knew workplaces are merciless. They don't have to say anything to punish you. They just stop inviting you to things. They stop trusting you. They stop imagining you as leadership material. They stop picturing you as stable. Reputation doesn't die with a headline. It dies in whispers. I stepped back, looking at both of them, these two people who'd decided their desires were more important than their commitments. Behind them, the table of food looked absurdly normal. Potato salad sweating in the heat, buns stacked in a basket, a bottle of ketchup tipped on its side like it had collapsed. A child ran by with a toy, oblivious, laughing, and the sound cut through everything like a reminder that the world always contains innocence, even when adults ruin their own lives. "Enjoy the barbecue," I said. "I hope it was worth it." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried because the crowd was already leaning toward silence, the way people do when they realize the social contract has shifted and they're not sure what's permitted anymore. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the backyard did what crowds always do after a confrontation they didn't expect. It tried to heal itself by pretending nothing had happened. Conversations resumed in stuttering bursts, voices rising and falling like waves. Someone laughed too loudly again. Someone asked, "Did you try the ribs?" as if ribs could glue morals back together. A couple near the drink cooler suddenly became fascinated by the ice. The host, one of Dominic's friends, I think, stood frozen by the grill with tongs in his hand, eyes wide, unsure whether to keep cooking or call an ambulance for the atmosphere. Dominic didn't chase me. That told me everything. He wanted control more than he wanted Alicia. If he ran after me, he'd look guilty. If he stayed, he could try to salvage his image, smooth it over, tell the crowd I was emotional, that I'd misunderstood, that marriage was complicated. He'd try to turn my calm into instability, because men like Dominic believe the only way to survive public judgment is to make someone else look unreasonable. Alicia did call my name. "Aaron," she said, and her voice cracked as it reached for me. "Aaron, please." I didn't turn around. Not because I hated her, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because turning around would have been permission. It would have been an opening for negotiation, for explanation, for the familiar loop where she cried, and I softened, and the truth got diluted into something easier to live with. I'd spent too long living in diluted truth. I wanted the undiluted version now, even if it burned. I walked down the side path toward the gate, the sound of the party behind me fading in layers. Laughter, then music, then the faint clink of glasses, then only the hum of traffic beyond the fence. My shoes scuffed lightly on the stone, and with every step I felt lighter, not because I was happy, but because I was no longer performing stability for people who didn't deserve it. At the gate, I paused, one hand resting on the wood for a heartbeat. I could still hear Alicia behind me, her voice smaller now, pleading in a tone I'd once rushed to rescue. But I didn't turn. Because the moment you start turning back, you teach them you can be pulled. And I wasn't pullable anymore. I opened the gate and stepped out into the street, letting it swing shut behind me with a soft, final click, and the sound felt like the beginning of something I'd forgotten was possible. Peace. I had said what I needed to say, and now it was time to figure out what came next. The storm hit on a Tuesday night in late September, one of those sudden autumn thunderstorms that seem to come out of nowhere and shake the world like a snow globe. I was sitting in my living room, reading a book and listening to the rain pound against the windows when headlights swept across my front yard. 3 months had passed since Janet's barbecue. 3 months of lawyers and mediations, of dividing assets and negotiating the dissolution of a 12-year marriage. Alicia had moved out in July, taking half our furniture and most of our mutual friends. Dominic had moved out of his house in August, leaving Janet with a substantial settlement and a renewed sense of purpose. The headlights belonged to Dominic's BMW, and through the rain-streaked window, I could see him sitting behind the wheel, staring at my house like a man trying to work up the courage for something he knew was a bad idea. My phone rang. Alicia. "Greg, Dominic is on his way to your house. He's been drinking and he's angry about the deposition yesterday. I tried to stop him, but he's already here. Don't let him in. He's not thinking clearly." I looked out the window at the man who'd helped destroy my marriage, sitting in his expensive car in my driveway, and felt a familiar surge of anger mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "Thanks for the warning," I said, and hung up. The deposition Alicia had mentioned was part of Janet's divorce proceedings. Dominic's lawyers had been trying to minimize his assets and shift blame for the marriage's failure, but yesterday's session hadn't gone well for him. Janet's attorney had been thorough and relentless, painting a picture of a serial philanderer who'd used his position of authority to seduce subordinates. The revelation that Alicia hadn't been his first affair had been particularly damaging. 2 other women had come forward, both former employees, both willing to testify about Dominic's pattern of behavior. His reputation was in ruins, his marriage was over, and his financial future looked increasingly bleak. Now he was in my driveway, drunk and angry, and looking for someone to blame for the consequences of his own choices. I opened my front door and stepped onto the porch, letting the rain soak through my shirt as I waited for him to make his move. After a few minutes, he got out of his car and walked toward me with the careful precision of a man trying not to appear intoxicated. "We need to talk," he said when he reached the bottom of my porch steps. "So talk." He looked up at me, rain running down his face, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. "This has gone far enough. The lawyers, the depositions, Janet's vindictive bullshit, it needs to stop." "Take it up with Janet. She's the one divorcing you. Janet's doing this because you encouraged her. You and your public humiliation at that goddamn barbecue." I laughed, and the sound was swallowed by the thunder rolling overhead. "I encouraged her? Dominic, you encouraged her when you decided to fuck my wife in hotel rooms while she sat at home worrying about your blood pressure." His face flushed, and he took a step up onto the porch. "You self-righteous son of a bitch. You act like you're some kind of victim, but you drove Alicia away with your petty jealousy and your small-town mentality. Is that what she told you? That I drove her away?" "She told me the truth. That you were boring, predictable, content to live your little restaurant manager life without any ambition or passion." The words stung because there was enough truth in them to hurt. I had been content with our life, had been satisfied with our routine, had perhaps taken our marriage for granted in the way that long-married couples sometimes do. "You're right," I said. "I was boring. I was predictable. I was a faithful husband who came home every night and didn't fuck around with other people's wives. You were a dead end. She needed more than you could give her." "And you were what she needed? A married man twice her age who promised her what? That you'd leave your wife? That you'd build a new life together?" Dominic's expression shifted, and I saw something that looked like guilt flicker across his features. "That's none of your business." "Actually, it is my business. Because while you were making promises you had no intention of keeping, I was the one dealing with her lies and her distance and her contempt for our marriage. I never made her any promises." The admission hung between us like a confession. So that was it. He'd seduced my wife with charm and attention and the thrill of an illicit affair, but he'd never had any intention of leaving Janet. Alicia had been a diversion, a midlife crisis made flesh, nothing more. Does she know that? I asked. His silence was answer enough. Jesus Christ, Dominic. You destroyed 2 marriages for a few months of hotel room sex, and you never even intended to follow through. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It was supposed to be discreet. Discreet, right. And when it stopped being discreet, when we caught you, your plan was what? To go back to Janet and pretend nothing happened? Janet didn't have to make it public. She could have handled it privately like adults do. I stared at him. This man who'd helped wreck my life, standing on my porch in the rain, complaining that his wife hadn't been more understanding about his adultery. Get off my property. We're not done talking. Yes, we are. You came here drunk, looking for someone to blame for your problems. But your problems are your own making, and I'm done being your scapegoat. He took another step up the porch, close enough now that I could smell the whiskey on his breath. You think you're better than me? You think your marriage was so perfect? I think my marriage was honest. Whatever problems Alicia and I had, we could have worked through them if she'd been willing to try instead of looking for excitement in hotel rooms. She tried. She tried to talk to you, tried to get you interested in something beyond your little restaurant world, but you were too self-absorbed to notice. And your solution was to seduce her. My solution was to give her what she needed: attention, conversation, someone who appreciated her intelligence and her ambition. In hotel rooms. Yes, in hotel rooms, because that's where she wanted to be. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the conversation into a shouting match conducted in a downpour. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating Dominic's face in stark black and white. You know what I think? I said, raising my voice over the thunder. I think you're here because Alicia finally figured out that you were never going to leave Janet. I think she realized that she destroyed her marriage for a man who saw her as a temporary diversion. And now you're angry because your midlife crisis has consequences. His face twisted with rage, and for a moment, I thought he might actually take a swing at me. Instead, he pulled out his phone and held it up like a weapon. You want to know the truth? Here's the truth. He scrolled through his messages, then held the phone out so I could see the screen. It was a text conversation between him and Alicia, dated just hours earlier. Alicia. This has to stop. Janet's lawyers are destroying you, and Greg won't even talk to me. Dominic. What do you want me to do? I can't undo what's already been done. Alicia. You said we'd be together. You said once the divorces were final, we'd start over. Dominic. I said a lot of things. That doesn't make them promises. Alicia. So that's it? You're just going to abandon me? Dominic. I'm not abandoning you. I'm being realistic. Janet's going to take everything. I can't afford to start over with anyone. I read the messages twice, feeling a mixture of vindication and pity. Vindication because it confirmed what I'd suspected, that Dominic had never intended to leave his wife. Pity because it showed how completely Alicia had been deceived. She really thought you were going to choose her, I said. She thought a lot of things. Most of them were fantasies. And you encouraged those fantasies. I encouraged her to feel good about herself. There's a difference. I looked at this man. This pathetic excuse for a human being who'd destroyed 2 marriages and was now standing in my yard complaining about the consequences, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger anymore, but a cold, calculating fury. You know what, Dominic? You're right. This has gone far enough. He looked surprised by my sudden agreement. Finally, so you'll talk to Janet? Convince her to settle for less? No. I'm going to make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are. I pulled out my own phone and opened the neighborhood social media app, the same platform where local residents shared recommendations for contractors and complained about barking dogs. What are you doing? I started typing, my fingers moving quickly across the screen. I'm sharing your text conversation with the neighborhood. I'm telling everyone how you seduced my wife with promises you never intended to keep, how you destroyed your own marriage for a few months of hotel room sex, and how you're now trying to blame everyone else for your problems. You can't do that. Watch me. I hit the post button and held up my phone so he could see the screen. The post was already live, visible to every resident in our neighborhood, complete with screenshots of his text conversation with Alicia. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, lunging toward me. I stepped aside, and his momentum carried him into the porch railing. He spun around, his face twisted with rage, and took another swing at me. This time I caught his wrist and twisted, using his own drunken momentum to send him stumbling down the porch steps. He landed hard in my front yard, his expensive suit now thoroughly soaked and muddy. As he struggled to get back to his feet, car doors began slamming in the street. My neighbors, drawn by the commotion and alerted by my social media post, were emerging from their houses to witness the final act of our neighborhood drama. Richard appeared at my side, having run across the street through the rain. "Greg, what's going on?" "Dominic came to discuss the error of my ways," I said, not taking my eyes off the man struggling to stand in my front yard. "I was just explaining to him that some errors can't be corrected." Janet's voice cut through the rain from the sidewalk. "Dominic Carter, you pathetic excuse for a man. Get off Greg's property before I call the police." She was standing under an umbrella, flanked by several other neighbors who'd been drawn by the spectacle. Her voice carried the authority of a woman who'd found her power in the aftermath of betrayal. "This is all your fault," Dominic shouted at her, rain streaming down his face. "If you'd handled this privately, none of this would have happened." "If you'd kept your pants zipped, none of this would have happened," she shot back. "But you couldn't do that, could you? You had to chase after a woman young enough to be your daughter, and now you're surprised that there are consequences." More neighbors were gathering now, drawn by the drama and the social media post that was already generating dozens of comments and reactions. This was better than any reality show, and it was happening right here in their own neighborhood. Dominic looked around at the growing crowd, at the faces staring at him with a mixture of disgust and fascination, and seemed to realize that he'd lost whatever remained of his dignity. "This isn't over," he said, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "It's been over since the night we found you in that hotel room. Everything since then has just been the cleanup." He staggered toward his car, slipping once in the muddy grass, his expensive suit ruined and his reputation in tatters. As he reached the BMW, he turned back one last time. "You'll regret this," he called out. "The only thing I regret," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the rain, "is that it took me so long to see what kind of man you really are." He got in his car and drove away, his taillights disappearing into the storm. The neighbors began to disperse, talking among themselves about what they'd witnessed, already turning the confrontation into the kind of story that would be told and retold for years to come. Janet walked up to my porch, shaking the rain off her umbrella. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She smiled, and for the first time since this whole mess began, it was a smile of genuine warmth rather than grim determination. "You know, Greg, I think we both are." As she walked back to her house, I stood on my porch watching the storm rage overhead, feeling something I hadn't felt in months: peace. Not happiness exactly, but a sense that justice had been served and that the worst was finally behind me. My phone buzzed with notifications from the neighborhood app, comments on my post, messages of support, and a few criticism from people who thought I'd gone too far. But I didn't care what anyone thought anymore. I'd told the truth, consequences be damned, and sometimes that's all a man can do. The rain began to ease, and through the clearing clouds, I could see the first stars appearing in the night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to rebuild my life from the wreckage of my marriage. But tonight, standing on my porch in the aftermath of the storm, I felt like a man who'd finally found his way home,